On the morning of April 19, 1775, British soldiers killed 8 American militiamen on Lexington Green outside of Boston. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Americans were British citizens, entitled to the same rights as other British citizens. The British Empire was the most prosperous, the freest, the greatest in the world. Americans were proud to be part of it, but they became the Empire's victims on that early April morning. The British agreed. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Americans were indeed British citizens, with the same responsibilities as other British citizens. They had to pay taxes and follow the laws. These were small prices to pay for being part of the most prosperous, the freest, the greatest empire in the world. But the city of Boston wasn't holding up its end of the bargain, forcing the Empire's soldiers to hand out justice on that early April morning. It was about land. Americans in the 13 colonies were squeezed in a narrow zone between the Atlantic Ocean and Appalachian Mountains. There was plenty of land to the west of the mountains, a place Americans later called the Old Northwest. But that was French territory, even though the French didn't really live there. They preferred to live in Canada or along the Mississippi River, leaving the Old Northwest open to Native Americans. The French were happy to have them there, since they acted as a buffer zone between themselves and the 13 colonies. They needed that buffer zone. Americans were already starting to settle in the Old Northwest, leading to conflict with the natives and each other. This was the original Wild West, with the final showdown being the French and Indian War. France asked, "How y'all fighting over my land and ain't none of y'all French?" The Americans responded, "Did y'all forget we're part of the British Empire? It won't be your land anymore once Britain spins the block." This pitted France and its day ones, the Native Americans, against Americans and its day one, the King of Britain. As good British citizens, Americans fought in the war. Some of them, like the printer Benjamin Franklin, even tried to get the 13 colonies to unite with each other in what was called the Albany Plan of Union. It didn't work. Too many colonies still saw each other as the ops. Still, the British and the Americans won, taking Canada and everything between the Appalachian Mountains and Mississippi River. France was kicked out of the North American mainland. Americans rubbed their hands together in anticipation of moving into the Old Northwest. Native Americans rubbed their hands together in anticipation of removing the head of any American dumb enough to try. Unlike the colonies, natives were able to unite with each other to attack Americans throughout the Old Northwest in what was called Pontiac's Rebellion. The British were like, "Yo, Americans, stop moving west. We ain't gonna keep dropping bans on wars that you start." This was called the Proclamation of 1763, and Americans were outraged. After all, they shed blood for that land. Now they couldn't even live on it? What happened to all of that freedom that came with living in the British Empire? They weren't even free to move now? This was unexpected. Things had been going so well in America. It seemed to be easier to make a living there than back in Britain. The whole reason they wanted to move west was because they had already filled the East Coast with farms. Farms gave them freedom, economic and political. Each colony had an assembly, a group that passed laws and taxes for the colony. Landowners were allowed to vote and serve on these assemblies. This was the political freedom they were used to. But the king was always watching. He appointed a governor for each colony to be his eyes and ears. They made sure the colonies were following British law, but their power was limited. Their salaries were paid by those taxes collected by colonial assemblies. Do anything to piss them off, do anything the landowners didn't like, and the governors wouldn't get paid. Any governor who knew their job understood they had to please both the king and the colonial assembly. Everyone was pleased when business was good. They all got paid, and in return, the colonies were free to do whatever they wanted. They could even break some of the king's laws from time to time. Governors looked the other way while Americans did a little dirt on the side. Why should anyone care as long as the money kept rolling in? The British called this policy Salutary Neglect, the 1700s version of don't fumble the bag. But getting the bag meant getting land, and the Proclamation of 1763 put a stop to that. The Americans were like, "Yo, king, we can't get paid if we don't take new land, and if we don't get paid, you don't get paid." Britain's new young king, George III, responded, "Yeah, about that. If you could start paying more taxes, that would be great. Thrashing France was kind of expensive, and we need you to help pay off the credit card. It's only fair. After all, you're the guys who wanted the war in the first place." The Americans didn't understand. "But we fought in the war. You're telling us we're going to have to pay for it and not be able to get the land? And the king was like, pretty much. What happened to everyone making a bag? What happened to salutary neglect? Y'all acting like France or Spain now, straight B-made. At the end of the day, George was the king, Americans were his subjects. There was no way around it. Or was there? When Britain passed the Stamp Act taxing paper goods in America, the colonies took action. The Colonial Assembly of Massachusetts invited the other colonies for a meeting in New York City to figure out how to resist the Stamp Act. Their best response came from the Colonial Assembly of Virginia. Virginia said, look, we don't mind paying taxes. We pay them all the time. But those are the taxes we put on ourselves here in Virginia. The people we elect in the Colonial Assembly make those taxes. But this Stamp Act thing, none of us voted for it. That was made by Parliament back in Britain, and we don't vote for Parliament. Why should a group of people we have no say in electing be allowed to tax us? See, when the king told the colonies they had to pay new taxes, he was merely enforcing a law passed by Parliament, a group of lawmakers back in Britain. Parliament works similar to the colonial assemblies in that landowners voted for them. But only British landowners were allowed to vote for Parliament. Americans had no say. The Virginia Assembly said that ain't right and wrote down their thoughts in what became known as the Virginia Resolves. They sent it off to Massachusetts, where it turned into the immortal slogan, no taxation without representation. In other words, if you're going to tax us, give us votes in Parliament. Otherwise, the only people who could tax us is us. The governor of Virginia, who, as we recall, was appointed by the king, said, I'm not gonna lie, Virginia Assembly, you ate with that one. I'm gonna have to smash the printing press here, so you can't make copies and send these words out to other colonies. I'm also gonna have to block you from going to New York City to meet with the other goons. He wasn't able to stop them from printing the Virginia Resolves, but he was able to stop them from going to New York. In October of 1765, representatives from 9 of the 13 colonies met on Wall Street in New York City in what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. They discussed ways to cooperate to avoid paying the tax. They sent a letter to the king telling him that taxation without representation was some BS. Respectfully, of course. They still liked being part of the British Empire. They just wanted to be treated fairly. To keep in contact with each other, the colonies established what were called committees of correspondence, networks of messengers on horseback that carried news from one colony to another, and from cities into the countryside. The Stamp Act Congress and committees of correspondence were the first examples of the colonies cooperating on anything. They had come a long way from the failed Albany Plan of Union 11 years earlier. Things heated up once everyone got back to their home colonies, especially in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. The Stamp Act taxed paper goods, and since everyone used paper, everyone would have to pay the tax at some point. Articles appeared in Massachusetts newspapers telling people that the tax violated their rights as British citizens because it was taxation without representation. Many of these articles were written by Samuel Adams, the original meme lord of American history. He perfected the art of political propaganda, printing his articles in newspapers and pamphlets distributed across the country by committees of correspondence. Adams knew how to reach people. He wrote simple prose that everyone could understand, from Harvard-educated lawyers to backcountry farmers. Adams asked his countrymen a simple question: were they citizens of the British Empire or slaves of it? As another slogan would later ask, which side are you on? But Adams did much more than make memes. After all, this was 1765. Taxes had to be collected by hand. The stamps for which the Stamp Act was named had to be placed on each paper product before it hit the stores. Samuel Adams and the Goon Squad went down to the customs house in Boston to make sure agents couldn't put a single stamp on a single paper product. Any agent who did so was in for harassment, up to and including being covered in boiling tar, doused with chicken feathers, and carried through the streets for everyone to see. The people who harassed tax collectors came to be called the Sons of Liberty, and Samuel Adams was the #1 son. This made collecting the tax way more trouble than it was worth for Britain. They got rid of it, but passed a law called the Declaratory Act, reminding Americans that Parliament still had the power to raise any tax it wanted at any time. Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty became W men in America and hated troublemakers back in Britain. Americans may have defended their freedoms for now, but at the end of the day, they still lived under the British Empire. All trade coming into the colonies had to go to Britain first. 2 years after the Stamp Act, Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, got the idea of taxing goods in Britain before sending them off to America. Instead, they attached fees to everything from paper to glass to tea, and since no stamps were required, Americans wouldn't be reminded that they were, in fact, paying a tax. Even better, no stamps meant there were no customs workers for the Sons of Liberty to harass. There was no getting around the taxes this time. Samuel Adams jumped into action by writing the Massachusetts Circular Letter, a strong restatement of the theme of no taxation without representation. The Massachusetts Assembly approved the letter and called on the other 12 colonies to join them in resisting the taxes. The governor of Massachusetts, who, as we remember, was the king's man, told them to say psych right now. They didn't, so the governor suspended the Massachusetts Assembly in response. Governors of other colonies followed suit, suspending any assembly who refused to oppose the Massachusetts Circular. Americans saw this as a violation of their rights worse than taxation without representation. The assemblies were the only voices they had in the British Empire. Suspending them was tantamount to silencing them, giving them no legal way to express their grievances. But Americans didn't need assemblies to resist. They could avoid taxes by simply not buying British goods. This was something the Americans called non-importation. Massachusetts, Virginia, and other colonies agreed to a non-importation protest. Instead of getting goods from Britain, Americans would make their own stuff. They would make their own clothes or drink coffee instead of British tea, for example. Or they'd smuggle. Americans love smuggling, which is illegal international trade. That's why the person selling drugs on the corner is a drug dealer, and the person bringing drugs in from one country into another is a drug smuggler. Americans didn't usually smuggle drugs, but they smuggled everything else. Any American with ships and international connections could get into the smuggling business. One of them was John Hancock, reportedly the richest guy in Boston. And the British were going to get him. The Townshend Acts gave British authorities writs of assistance in America, which was the right to search any home, business, or ship. They also changed the rules so that smugglers wouldn't face trial in Boston, where a jury full of Boston citizens was likely to find any smuggler not guilty. Instead, trials would be held in admiralty courts, where there was no jury, just a judge who made the final verdict. A judge hired and paid by the king. In other words, John Hancock was John Hancooked. In May of 1768, authorities stopped and searched one of Hancock's ships named the Liberty, where they allegedly found illegal Portuguese wine. Hancock allegedly offered the customs officer a bribe to look the other way, which the officer allegedly refused. In June, authorities tried to tow the Liberty away and announced they would press charges against John Hancock. A crowd of 3,000 people came out to Boston Harbor. When they failed to protect the Liberty from being towed, they assaulted any tax collector they could find. To add insult to injury, nobody in Boston offered evidence of John Hancock's guilt. They couldn't even put him on trial. It turned out that he wasn't John Hancooked after all. British authorities were getting rather tired of Boston continually making them look silly. They sent 2 regiments of soldiers to the city. Let's see them riot now. Bostonians wouldn't just have to host soldiers in their city, they had to host them in their homes, something called quartering. They'd have to provide warm beds and food if a soldier came knocking at their door. Citizens back in Britain had to quarter troops in their homes, so why not Americans? This was their chance to be treated like British citizens the way they wanted. But this wasn't the treatment Americans wanted. Most Bostonians refused to quarter troops. Instead, soldiers had to stay at Faneuil Hall, a popular meeting place where Samuel Adams had given many fiery speeches. Some soldiers deserted the army altogether, melting into the city to live like regular Bostonians. This meant they competed with Bostonians for jobs, making them even more hated. The soldiers who didn't desert stationed themselves on the street, where Bostonians cursed them as they walked by. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, a British soldier smashed a 13-year-old boy in the head with his gun. A crowd gathered around the soldier, pelting him with snowballs and daring him to fire his gun. More troops arrived at the scene, and at some point, one of them fired into the crowd. When all was said and done, 11 Americans were hit, and 5 of them lay dead. News spread fast through the colonies thanks to the committees of correspondence. Samuel Adams wrote a story that described what happened in Boston as a massacre, so the incident forever became known as the Boston Massacre. British authorities feared that Bostonians would riot again, so they promised that the soldiers would face trial in Boston where they could have Boston lawyers and be judged by a Boston jury. The British wanted to show that they would be fair. In other words, the soldiers were cooked now. They realized just how cooked they were when they met their lawyer, John Adams, cousin of Sam Adams. Oh boy, here we go. At the trial, Adams proved that many American witnesses lied about what they saw in order to make the soldiers look bad. He proved that the soldiers fired because they were scared boys surrounded by 50 angry Bostonians. Most importantly, they were never given orders to fire. Adams did such a good job defending them that the jury found the soldiers not guilty. Why did Adams do this? Did he betray his cousin Sam? Well, no. First of all, Adams had integrity. He believed everyone had the right to a fair trial. Second, Adams wanted to show the British that Americans were just as fair, just as civilized as they were. There was a stereotype back in Britain that Americans were savages who lived in the woods, ate raccoons, wore fur underwear, and attacked British authorities for no reason. Maybe now they changed their minds after Americans gave them a fair trial. And at the same time, Britain quietly allowed the Townshend taxes to expire. Just like with the Stamp Act, collecting taxes was more trouble than it was worth for them. The Americans had won again. But once again, Britain reminded America they still had the power to tax them. They got rid of all the taxes except the one on tea, just to show Americans that they were still British subjects who had to follow British law. Did this calm things down? Hell no. British ships were still out there trying to catch smugglers. One of them was a ship called the Gaspee, which patrolled the waters off Rhode Island. Americans in Rhode Island had a particular hatred for the Gaspee, whose crew had a reputation of being particularly unfair and assholish. In June of 1772, the Gaspee broke down near the coast of Newport, Rhode Island. The citizens of Newport took the opportunity to set the Gaspee on fire. British authorities announced that the perpetrators would be tried back in England for treason, a crime punishable by death. But similar to the John Hancock situation, British authorities couldn't find any witnesses and had to give up. Americans can't keep getting away with it, and the British were determined to not let them. They announced that the governor of Massachusetts would no longer be paid by taxes collected by the Colonial Assembly. Instead, he would be paid by the king. This ensured that the governor would do everything the king wanted and nothing the colony wanted. After all, he wanted to get paid, right? Now he didn't have to please the Americans the way he used to. This was important because Britain intended to collect the tea tax. If we recall, Britain got rid of all the taxes except for the one on tea. They got all of their tea from Asia through the East India Company. A new law called the Tea Act, passed in 1773, actually lowered the price of East India Company tea, to the point that it would be way cheaper than the tea sold by any smuggler. If they couldn't put John Hancock in jail, they were determined to drive him out of the smuggling business altogether. And it just so happened that, at that very moment, 7 British ships were on their way to America carrying a year's supply of tea for all the colonies. The colonies had 4 major ports where the ships could land: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Sam Adams used committees of correspondence to organize the granddaddy of all non-importation protests. Sons of Liberty in all 4 cities went down to the docks to wait for the ships to come in. Their goal? Don't let them unload their tea in America. If they can't unload it, then they can't sell it, and therefore Britain can't collect taxes on it. It's what happened in Boston later after the ships arrived that would become the stuff of American lore. 3 tea ships landed in Boston in December 1773. The Sons of Liberty blocked the tea from being unloaded. The governor of Massachusetts, now being paid by the king, told the ships, "You better not leave until you unload that tea." And so a standoff ensued. In the middle of the night of December 16th, Sons of Liberty, Samuel Adams among them, dressed as Mohawk Native Americans, boarded the 3 ships and dumped over 300 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This was millions of dollars worth of product, making this incident, later known as the Boston Tea Party, the most expensive tea party in history. They dressed as Mohawks not just as a disguise, but also because it was a symbolic statement. British people stereotyped Americans as savages. Dressing like Native Americans was kind of like the Americans saying, "Yeah, we're savages. We're gonna do something savage while looking like savages." It was both a troll job and extremely racist. Racist trolls? Sounds like Twitter after Elon bought it. 3 words describe Britain's response to the Tea Party. Oh, hell no. Americans done messed up this time, and they were gonna pay. Parliament passed a law that shut down the port of Boston until they repaid the value of the tea they had destroyed. No more trade. They passed a law dissolving the Massachusetts Colonial Assembly. No more government. They passed a law essentially giving British soldiers qualified immunity for killing Americans during riots. No more fair trials. And they passed a law giving all the land west of the Appalachian Mountains, that old Northwest Territory, the land Americans had wanted so badly, to Canada. No more land. Trade, government, fair trials, and land, the things that made Americans free in the British Empire, were gone. The Boston Tea Party troll job backfired. Now they really were being treated like savages. The Colonial Assembly of Virginia jumped into action immediately out of solidarity with Massachusetts. They called for a meeting of all 13 colonies in the city of Philadelphia to coordinate a response to these British laws, which Americans called the Intolerable Acts. In the meantime, Britain appointed a new governor for Massachusetts, Thomas Gage, a military officer. Americans saw him not so much as a governor than as a dictator, put in Massachusetts to enforce the laws that British called the Coercive Acts. The situation was spinning out of control. In October of 1774, it was time for the representatives of the 13 colonies to meet in the city of Philadelphia in what became known as the First Continental Congress. Actually, it was 12 colonies because Georgia didn't send any representatives. You see, southern colonies like Georgia tended to be a little more attached to Britain than the northern colonies. This was because Britain was their #1 customer for all their major crops: rice, indigo, and tobacco. Britain was the hand that fed them, and they didn't want to bite it. When the Continental Congress decided to cut off trade with Britain, Georgia and the Carolinas didn't exactly follow suit. The whole South got the reputation as quote-unquote loyalists, people loyal to Britain. On the other hand, areas like Massachusetts had people who were much more likely to challenge Britain, who were known as patriots. The division between loyalists and patriots would cause plenty of violence and misery in America in the years ahead. The Continental Congress begged the king to end the Intolerable Acts, but Americans didn't just have assemblies. They had militaries. As we've seen, Britain never really wanted to spend money to defend the colonies. One of the ways they saved money was by allowing Americans to form armies, called militias. A militia is a citizen's army. Men from all over the 13 colonies, from farmers to craftsmen to merchants, trained with firearms from time to time. The firearms were usually stored in a central location, like an armory. When trouble arose, these regular folk would come to the armory to get the guns. It was a way to have an army without paying a lot of money for it. Militias worked well for the colonies. The only enemies they really had that can do them any damage were Native Americans and enslaved people. A militia could assemble in plenty of time to respond to these threats. This is the origin of the right to bear arms that so many Americans today pretend to care about. But we should notice that it was a right for mostly white men to use weapons to defend themselves from their most immediate threats, who they saw as non-white people who they were brutalizing, like Native Americans and slaves. American militias had fought in the French and Indian War, but they usually got cooked by France's professional armies. Despite this performance, Americans still liked their militias. Why would they want a professional army? Professional armies were tools used by kings to step on the rights of citizens. Isn't this what was happening in Boston right now? Wasn't the British Army, now led by General Gage, there to make sure that Americans didn't exercise their right to trade, government, fair trial, and land? So the Continental Congress rang the alarm and demanded that all 13 colonies get their militias ready. They were advised to stockpile weapons and make sure that their officers were reliable patriots. After all, Today, General Gage was in Boston, but tomorrow he could be in New York or Philadelphia. Everyone needed to be ready to defend their rights as British citizens. General Gage knew all about militias. He also knew that they wouldn't be foolish enough to organize right under his nose in Boston, where his army ruled with an iron fist. Instead, they gathered weapons in the farms around Boston, out of sight of his men. In fact, the Patriots formed a committee of safety to lead the militia there, led by John Hancock and Samuel Adams. They were staying in the town of Lexington, where they ordered enough weapons to arm 15,000 men. And Gage was determined to find those weapons. He would send his men on raids into the countryside from time to time. The Committee of Safety decided that if Gage ever sent more than 500 men on these raids, it would be considered an attack and the militia would have the right to defend themselves. But nobody knew when Gage would have his next raid. The militia had to be ready to fight at a moment's notice, which is why they got the nickname Minutemen. And this brings us back to the beginning of the video, on that early April morning at Lexington Green. A patriot named Paul Revere, a Boston silversmith, noticed a force of around 700 of Gage's men leaving the city of Boston aboard ships. He figured they were on their way to one of those raids. He got on his horse bound for the town of Lexington to warn Adams and Hancock, which he did before being arrested by British authorities. When Gage's men showed up, the militia at Lexington was waiting for them. Neither side wanted to fire first, but someone did fire. An American. Maybe he dropped his gun, maybe he was nervous, maybe he was a troublemaker. But that shot got a response from the British, who left 8 Americans dead. Was this the start of the American Revolution? Was it a start of a war for independence? It was probably neither. Americans weren't fighting for independence. They had been begging the king to recognize their rights as British citizens. They desperately wanted to remain British, but their rights weren't taken seriously. They were treated like savages. From the British point of view, the Americans were very good at demanding their rights, but not so good at fulfilling their responsibilities as British subjects. They defied the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding them from moving west. They tarred and feathered tax collectors. They harassed soldiers and refused to quarter them. They protected smugglers and other criminals, even making them leaders of their militias. They had extra-legal meetings with others when their assemblies were shut down. They refused to trade and dumped British tea into the harbor. In other words, the revolution had started way before Gage's men showed up at Lexington Green. Americans had been feeling increasingly marginalized by the British. The British had been feeling increasingly frustrated with the Americans. Neither side saw much room for compromise. A chasm opened up between them. A chasm into which the first drops of blood fell on that early April morning. Was this just the beginning? Or would both sides be able to come together as fellow citizens of the greatest empire in the world?